So first of all, just let me extend my thanks to the organizers for asking me to present to you today. I'm very grateful for that. It's just a really great honor for me to be able to make the presentation, to have done the briefing report. I have been asked to make a presentation on the length of the president's term and whether the president's term should be reduced from 7 years to 5 years, and if so, should presidential elections be held at the same time as local and European elections. As we heard this morning, there is plenty of things that could be debated about the presidency, the presidential powers, nominating procedures for the presidency, financing of presidential election campaigns. There's all sorts of things that could be debated about the presidency. But what I was asked to do and what you've been asked to debate is the issue of the length of the presidential term. So that's what I'm going to make a presentation on. If other questions arise, then I'll leave it to Tom and others to decide how we discuss those. So just to begin, when the presidency was established in 1937, quite a lot of countries had 7-year presidential terms. So in that sense, it was fairly standard at that time to have a 7-year presidential term. But things have moved on. Now, most countries with presidents have a 5-year presidential term. So Ireland, therefore, is out of line with most other countries. Now, I think that's especially the case since the early 1990s, when a lot of Central and East European countries and countries elsewhere established presidencies, and most of those gave their presidents 5-year terms. So in a sense, I think this is a question that's come onto the political agenda in recent years because Ireland has become more out of line with other countries. That's not necessarily a reason for changing the length of the president's term, reducing the length of the president's term. You could quite happily say that it doesn't matter that Ireland's out of line. You could quite happily say that Ireland, it's a good thing that Ireland is not quite unique, but that Ireland is different from other countries. But nonetheless, I think in terms of the context of why this question is being asked, I think it is the fact that Ireland is increasingly out of line that it's perhaps come up now when it didn't come up previously. So if we just turn to the arguments for and against, so you have the briefing document, I'm going to just run through them. I think the argument you hear most often about why the president's term should be reduced deals with an issue that you've already heard about this morning, and I think you'll probably hear a lot about during the sessions to follow over the coming year. It's about public engagement. It's about getting more people involved in politics. It's about getting people more active in the political process. So obviously, if you reduce the president's term for 5 years, presidential elections should happen more frequently. Therefore, people will have more of an opportunity to take part in the political process. As many of you know, at the moment, if a presidential election is coming up and there's only one candidate, then there's no popular vote. The president is returned uncontested. So that means that at the moment with a 7-year presidential term, you can sometimes have 14 years between one presidential election and another. So that would be the case, for example, with Mary McAleese. She was elected in 1997. There was no contest in 2004. And so the next presidential election was in 2011. So 14 years between one presidential and the next presidential election and the next presidential election is clearly a very long time. So people would argue that reducing the president's term to 5 years will give people more of an opportunity to vote for the president and will allow people to be more involved in the political process. Clearly, reducing the president's term by itself doesn't stop the potential for uncontested elections, so they could still happen. But I suppose what would be the case, if there were an uncontested election, you'd be likely to have a presidential election maybe once every 10 years, which is still a long time in international standards, but nonetheless, at least it would be a shorter period of time than has very often happened at the present. So the argument about reducing the president's term is quite strongly made by people who want more people to get involved in the political process. The second reason is about accountability. In some sense, it's a very similar argument. A key element of democracy is that we elect representatives. If we like what they do, then we vote them into office again. If we don't like what they do, then we have the opportunity to vote them out of office. Now, we've been very lucky, I think, in terms of the sorts of presidents that we've had. They've been very popular usually. And therefore, maybe there hasn't been a desire to hold presidents to account in the same way that sometimes happens in other countries. But imagine if you had a controversial president or a very unpopular president for whatever reason. 7 years, again, is a long time to be able to hold that person to account. So people would say to increase the degree of accountability in the political process, reduce the president's term to 5 years, and you will increase the accountability of the political system. And again, that's good for democracy. Another argument is that comes up is very different altogether. It's about the types of candidates or the types of presidents that you might get. Some people argue that certain types of candidates are put off from even standing, never mind being elected, but from even standing for the presidency because of the length of the term. So, for example, younger people or younger candidates, maybe candidates with a business background, they simply can't afford to take out 7 years, never mind even perhaps 14 years, from their careers or from their lives to even try to stand for the presidency. Whereas if the presidential term was reduced to 5 years, then it might be the case that more candidates with that profile would come along. And some people say that would be a good thing, that we need to diversify the type of candidates, representatives that we have, maybe with younger candidates, maybe with more business-oriented candidates. So reducing the presidential term might help that. I think there are perhaps 2 points just to note there. One is that in the Constitution at the moment there is an age limit for presidential candidates, which is 35. So I think 35 is young. But nonetheless, if you really want young candidates and wanted it below 35, you'd have to have a constitutional amendment to change that. So there would be a limit to how young candidates could be, even if this particular reform were to encourage younger candidates. And also, some people would say that reducing the president's term really just misses the point here, because what really stops a more diverse set of candidates from emerging are the nomination procedures. It's not really the length of the presidential term that will generate a different type of candidates. But nonetheless, the argument is made that reducing the president's term might encourage a different set of candidates to stand. Another argument that you sometimes hear is sort of related to the last two in some senses, but it's about popular presidents. So we talked about unpopular presidents, perhaps holding them to account. There's an argument that sometimes people put forward that, again, the 7-year presidential term puts off popular incumbent presidents, popular sitting presidents, from standing for election again. So presidents might make the calculation that they've been in office for 7 years. Another 7 years is a very long time. And even if they're popular, they decide to stand down. The example that's used here would be Mary Robinson. So she was elected in 1990. If the presidential term had been 5 years and she'd been asked to stand for re-election in 1995, she may well have been re-elected. She may well have decided that she wanted to stand for re-election in 1995, in which case she would have been in office until 2000. But as it was, the presidential term was 7 years, so therefore she was up for re-election in 1997. By that time, other opportunities had come along. She perhaps made the calculation that, another 7 years and 14 years in total was too long a time. So therefore, Mary Robinson, who was a very popular president, was sort of lost, if you like, to the presidency because of the length of the presidential term. So a shorter term for the presidency might not only allow unpopular presidents to be held accountable, it might encourage popular presidents to stay on for a second term, because 10 years, again, is a lot shorter than 14 years. And the final argument in favor is a sort of a preemptive strike, almost. You hear the argument that if the presidential term is reduced to 5 years, then there'll be more frequent presidential elections. Elections cost money, cost the taxpayer money. Therefore, with more frequent elections, there'll be a greater cost to the taxpayer, and that money, especially in the state of the economy at the moment, will be better spent on other things than presidential elections. That begs the question of how much presidential elections cost the taxpayer, and it's actually quite difficult to determine that figure. It's certainly the case that candidates who reach a certain amount of the quota are entitled to a certain amount of money reimbursed for their campaign expenses. In 2011, it was €200,000 for each candidate, and 3 candidates were able to reach that particular part of the quota last time. So the cost to the taxpayer in terms of a reimbursement of expenses at the last presidential election was €600,000. But in addition to that, by law, each presidential candidate is entitled to send out a leaflet to everybody on the electoral register. And that too, send out a leaflet free of charge. So that cost will be taken up by the taxpayer. Now, I think in 2011, there were just over 3 million people on the electoral register. There were 7 candidates. So that's 21, a maximum, potential maximum of about 21, maybe more, 22 million pieces of election literature going through people's doors that the taxpayer was picking up the cost of. So that could be about €10 million. I haven't seen an official figure that costs that. But that's clearly a lot more money than actually candidates are reimbursed for their electoral expenses. So presidential elections do cost the taxpayer money. There are other costs as well, but I think they're relatively minor to those two. So if you're in favor of reducing the presidential term, how do you counter that argument? And I think people say 3 things. They say, 1, we're a democracy. Democracies have elections. Whether we like it or not, elections cost money. And therefore, we can't stop having elections just to save money. Therefore, we just have to accept that there will be a cost to the taxpayer for elections. I think we can do a bit better than that. We can also, I think, say, well, there are ways in which the cost of presidential elections could be reduced. Even before the 2011 presidential election, the amount of campaign expenses that were reimbursed by the taxpayer, that was reduced from €260,000 to €200,000. So it is possible to reduce, and politicians have shown the will to reduce the amount of money that candidates get reimbursed for their expenses. But in addition, there are all sorts of ways in which the cost of leafleting could be reduced as well. A leaflet might not have to go to every voter on the electoral register. It could go to every household. You could have one leaflet for all the presidential candidates rather than each presidential candidate sending out a leaflet, which would reduce the number considerably. So there are all sorts of ways. You might opt out of a leaflet if you had it on your polling card and when you were registering, you ticked a box to say, I don't want a leaflet, I'm happy just to go on the internet and look for information. There are all sorts of ways in which you could reduce those costs. So people who say people who argue in favor of reducing the president's term will say that the cost of presidential elections doesn't have to go up. And in fact, a third reason they sometimes put forward to say is that the cost might even go down, because if you had presidential elections at the same time as European and local elections, then you could bundle a lot of these costs together, bundle a lot of the campaign expense costs together, bundle a lot of the leaflet costs together, and who knows, the cost of presidential elections or the cost of elections in total might come down. So I think those are the basic arguments in favor. What about the arguments against? I mean, the first one deals, I think, explicitly with this notion of public engagement. So the argument was that more frequent presidential elections, more people will be engaged. Well, the flip side of that is electoral fatigue. People simply get fed up with voting. We've seen in recent referendums, turnout figures have been relatively low. The presidential election turnout was lower than at the Doyle election in the same year in 2011. So there's no guarantee that people will be more engaged with politics, more engaged with the political process if presidential elections are held more frequently. The second argument against addresses this notion of candidates, and I've already said that some people would argue that reducing the length of the president's term isn't going to affect the type of candidates at all. Really, that's about the nomination process. But also, sometimes people make the argument that a 7-year presidential term generates the right sort of presidential candidate. The president has very few powers. 7 years is a long time. If you're a very ambitious party political figure working your way up through the political process, you might not want to go to the presidency for such a long period of time for an office which has so few powers. So maybe it's the case that it's not surprising, therefore, that the sorts of presidents that we've had over time have been associated with political parties, but nonetheless have also had a profile of being above political parties as well. And maybe a 7-year presidential term encourages candidates who are relatively above political parties. And if you were to reduce the length of the presidential term, you might encourage more party political candidates to stand at presidential elections, and that might politicize the presidency. Another argument against it addresses this notion of the nature of the presidency even more directly. People trust the presidency generally. So we say people trust the presidency more than they trust political parties, more than they trust the Dáil. One of the reasons for that is because the presidency is seen to be above politics, representing Ireland at home and abroad in a non-partisan way. If the president's term was reduced to 5 years, then the president would serve no longer than the standard term of one Dáil. At the moment, 7 years, the length of the president's term has to be longer than the term of one Dáil. So the argument that people make is that because the president's term is longer than the term of a Dáil, again, that increases the chances that the presidency is out of the political fray, away from the sort of hurly-burly, day-to-day sort of party political arena. Again, it's a notion that the 7-year term actually encourages this sort of non-partisan, above-politics figure that people want in a presidency. That's a sort of a similar argument which deals with the nature of the partisan nature of the presidency, or the non-partisan nature of the presidency. And some people will simply say, listen, you told me that the cost of elections wasn't going to go up, or that it could even go down if presidential elections, the term of presidential of the presidency was reduced. Some people will simply say, well, listen, politicians aren't going to do that. It's bound to increase the cost of the taxpayer, so the cost to the taxpayer will go up. So some people make that argument. Now, if you believe that the president's term should be reduced to 5 years, then you can ask a second question: should presidential elections be held at the same time as local and European elections? The date of European elections is fixed, so the next one will be in June 2014, it's every 5 years, so then June 2019, June 2024, etc. If you were to reduce the president's term to 5 years, probably starting in 2019, you could hold the presidential election on the same day as European elections, which is now the same day that local elections are being held as well. Now, you could say, well, we've decided we don't want the president's term to go to 5 years, so we're not even going to debate whether presidential elections should be aligned with local and European elections. But some of the reasons for maybe reducing the president's term to 5 years are actually bundled up with some of these arguments in favor of aligning the three elections, having them on the same day as well. So therefore, it is worth at least thinking about the arguments for putting all three elections on the same day. I think there are two arguments basically on both sides. One, again, is very familiar. More people will turn out to vote. People are engaged by local issues. People are engaged by European issues, but nonetheless, they are what's known as second-order elections. They're less important elections. Therefore, the turnout level tends to be lower. If you have presidential elections on the same day, then that might increase the turnout for those elections, and also there might be people who would turn out to local elections who might not turn out to a presidential election. So it could increase turnout for presidential elections as well, relative to what it is now. So again, this could all be part of a notion of getting people engaged in politics, and it could also be a way of countering that argument that I gave you against reducing the president's term, namely voter fatigue. Okay, so you have more frequent presidential elections, people will get fed up with voting. Well, if you have them at the same time as European and local elections, then there might be more frequent presidential elections, but there might not, the number of elections overall might not increase. So therefore, you wouldn't have that problem of voter fatigue because of extra presidential elections. The second argument, I think, in favor of having presidential, local, and European elections on the same day, again, is the cost argument. So it's a genuine concern that having more presidential elections might cost more money for the taxpayer. But as I said, if you have all three elections on the one day, then you can have sort of economies of scale. You can bundle up costs. You can find ways of leafleting more efficiently, and therefore the cost, either the extra cost of the taxpayer might be minimized, or even some people will go further and say that the cost could actually be reduced overall to the taxpayer. So there is a cost argument as well there. In terms of argues against aligning all three elections, then I think the first argument goes back to what you really want from the presidency. So I think the argument here is that when people choose a president, they're looking for a particular type of candidate. They're looking for one with a certain stature. They're looking for one who will be able to represent the country impartially. And a presidential election allows presidential candidates to try and put their own qualities forward in that way, and for people to vote as to exactly what sort of president they want. If you have the three elections on the same day, then obviously local and European elections are going to be debated alongside the presidential election. And some people fear that not only will these three elections be sort of debated separately from each other, but that the various issues will get mixed up. So the presidency will be asked about local issues. The presidential candidates will be asked about European issues. People might vote for the president on the basis of something they said about a local issue or a European issue. In other words, when people come to choose the president, they'll no longer be choosing a president solely on the basis of what type of presidential candidate they want, but they'll be voting for a president on the basis of what local issue might be out there or what European issue might be out there. Now, the counter to that is simply to say, listen, people are not stupid, people are relatively sophisticated in the way that they vote. They can tell the difference between local issues, European issues, and presidential issues, so therefore there's no real need to worry about this. But nevertheless, it is an argument you hear against putting all three elections on the same day. I think the final argument for not putting presidential elections with European and local elections deals with this notion that the date of the presidential election will be fixed. So if it's 5 years held at the same time as the European local elections, then we know in advance, a bit like the Americans know in advance when their presidential election will be in 4, 8, 12, 16 years' time. We will know when our presidential election is every 5 years. The date will be fixed. But then, of course, the question happens, well, what happens if the president resigns or dies in office? You have to have a new president. Now, that's going to have to be dealt with anyway, but the question might be, well, do you have another election for a short period of time before the fixed date arrives again? Do you have to create a vice presidency like there is in the US? And the vice president becomes president for this short period before the next presidential? Do you have some other system? It's easy enough to come up with some sort of way of dealing with this eventuality. But the argument is that whatever scenario you come up with, whatever solution you have to this particular problem, the person who's in office then for that period of time will be seen as a second-class president, an interim president, sort of a stand-in. And that, again, will devalue the presidency. I think those in favor of reducing the president's term will say, well, listen, this has happened, but it happens very, very rarely. So it shouldn't really be a reason for not reducing the president's term, for not then aligning them with the other two sorts of elections. So I think those are the main arguments for and against reducing the president's term, and then the issue of aligning the elections. I just wanted to say, to finish up with, that I know of one opinion poll that was taken that did ask this question, and people were pretty much split. I think it was 46-36 in favor of reducing the president's term. So there wasn't an overwhelming body of opinion either for or against in the public on this issue, though it has to be said the issue hasn't been debated either, and it could be when the issue is debated that those figures could change very much. And just in terms of the submissions to the convention, I think by yesterday afternoon or yesterday lunchtime, there'd been, I think, 24 submissions to the convention on this particular issue. And if I remember correctly, I think 6 were in favor of reducing the president's term. The others were opposed or seemed to be opposed. And of the 6 that were in favor, I think 3 were in favor of aligning the 3 elections. So there's a difference there between the one opinion poll that I know of that's been taken in terms of how people feel about this issue and the sorts of submissions that have come into to the convention about the issue. So thank you very much.